Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has finally backed down. This is a clear win for thousands of protesters who had been thronging the streets, voicing their concerns about the plan which Netanyahu was almost about to set into motion. After months of protests that saw the country in serious ruptures, the Israeli Prime Minister has decided not to go ahead with his plans of the so-called judicial reforms, at least for the time being. This past Sunday, the protests had intensified several folds after Benjamin Netanyahu had fired his defense minister who had openly opposed these judicial reforms. Over the past few months, tens of thousands of Israelis had rallied in the cities of Tel Aviv, Haifa, Jerusalem and others to protest against what they had been calling erosion and downgrading of democracy. But what had happened that made people almost rise in a revolution style? In this video, we explain what were the changes that the Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu had proposed and why were people so livid about it. But before that, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to Oneindia. Few months back, Justice Minister Yariv Levin had presented plans for what the right-wing government described as a reform of governance. Those proposals included several legislative initiatives aimed at limiting the power of the Israeli Supreme Court and the legal advisors to the government. During the protests, the protesters had held Israeli flags and signs that said "criminal government, the end of democracy" and had also shouted other slogans. Now let's look at this issue in little detail now. The first controversial proposal was that of a derogation clause or an override clause that would have allowed the Israel's parliament, the Knesset, to annul a Supreme Court decision with just a simple majority. What this meant was that suppose the Israel Supreme Court rules on anything very reformative, but if the lawmakers were not in favor of it due to their own political calculations, then they could have overturned that decision just by a simple majority. In the current scheme of things, the Supreme Court can't just discard government decisions or legislation. It must rule that the action being cancelled contradicts one of Israel's basic laws. There are 12 laws that are supposed to be a foundation for a future Israeli constitution. But what this plan envisaged was that it would give the smallest possible majority in the Knesset, 61 lawmakers out of 120, the power to then override the Supreme Court. Israel does not have a constitution and the separation of powers between the legislative and executive branches is very weak. This makes the Supreme Court the only institution with the power to limit government actions and legislation passed by a parliamentary majority. But this proposal would have taken that power away. Another major point of contention was about changing the composition of the committee that selects Israel's judges. This part, if agreed upon, would have increased the power of the politicians and decreased that of judges and lawyers, effectively giving the government the power to appoint judges and, more critically, the Supreme Court justices. Then, there were also plans to turn the legal advisors who usually report to the Attorney General into political appointees, totally controlled by ministers. This mattered because if suppose a minister wants to take illegal action, then the legal advisor's role is to warn them that they are planning an illegal move and to raise the matter with the Attorney General. Under the proposed arrangement, the legal advisors chosen by the ministers would have lacked the independence to challenge the politicians. And finally, the nail in the coffin was to cancel the reasonableness standard that has been used by the court over the years to reverse government decisions. All this would have effectively made the Supreme Court an exercise in futility and an institution that would just have been a paper tiger. But that was not all about it. The original aim of Netanyahu was to consolidate power, unfettered and unrestrained. The opponents of the move have been claiming that Netanyahu was bent on passing these far-reaching decisions just to cling on to power, to make the judiciary pliant so that he could have his corruption charges thrown away. They say all this was being done just for personal benefits and to dilute the rule of law in Israel. And that is why tens of thousands of Israelis had been protesting against these judicial reforms. This was all about the protests and the reasons behind it. We hope you would like this new video. Thank you so much for watching.